welcome to another episode of From the Practice Room. We're very excited about today's topic. This is a topic that Polina and I are both really passionate about, and we've been talking about for years and years, and so we're excited. Yeah, literally, for as long as I've known you, I feel like we've been talking about this.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, but we're excited to open this conversation up with you all. But before we do, we just like to give you guys a little update on our lives, because it's been some time. Mm-hmm. But would you like to give a life update, Poe?
Yeah, so Mindy, you know this, but I've been into the law of attraction lately, which sounds very bizarre and very wacky to those who may not know what it is, but I'm not going to go too much into detail. However, I've been applying it to my practice kind of lately in the sense of visualization, because visualization is a very important part of manifesting things through the law of attraction. And when I was kind of getting into it all, I was watching this documentary on Netflix called The Secret. And it's like they talk a lot about how important the mind is, because in essence, the mind can't tell the difference between what is reality and what is going on inside the mind. So if you imagine something in your head, then you can you can feel all the sensations, you can smell what's going on around you, you can you feel exactly what that situation is. Basically, your mind will think that that's what reality is. And they kind of tested it with Olympic athletes where they had them train just using their minds for, I think it was about a month or so. And afterwards, the part of the brain that is activated when they're physically going through the motions was activated in the same way when they were doing it in their minds. And so they were able to train in the same way, but just in their minds. And so anyways, this visualization is just very powerful. And so I've kind of realized how it can apply to practice in a certain way, because I think I've always kind of heard that the imagination is very important in your practice. And I understand how to use it musically, creating the sound that I want. However, something that I always struggle with is the feeling and the physical aspect of achieving that. And so I realized kind of recently that if I can feel in my head, if I can imagine what the feeling and the sensation is like of playing it, I can strive towards it and essentially get there. And so the imagination aspect of it has been very, very helpful and very efficient in getting what I want out of the piano. So that's been kind of interesting.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, that ties a lot into, I think we talked about this in the last episode about practicing away from your instrument and how important that is. And I think this just confirms that we need both practicing in front of your instrument and practicing away from your instrument. It's very interesting. Yeah, I've had similar experiences recently because I was preparing for my graduation recital. I graduated last week, and the day before graduation, I had this Zoom recital. Yes. And I think this quarter was just a struggle for me because you all know I was dealing with an injury, and so I didn't get to practice a lot. And so towards the end, the last 2 weeks before my recital, I was freaking out because I was I haven't even lived with these pieces for long enough, and I physically haven't been playing them for a long time. And what could I do? It was just, that was the situation, and I had to kind of deal with it. And so I was doing just a lot of mental practice as well, because I had to, because I still couldn't practice a lot. And then realizing the same thing where it's if you're not imagining the music first, if you're just striving to just get all the notes, because really at that point I was just I'm not even comfortable with the notes, so I need to get comfortable with the notes, But actually for so much of it, I realized I entered into this panicked state of practicing where I was just I completely would forget about what I'm actually supposed to be portraying through the music. And I think once I realized that and I snapped out of that, and I really started thinking about what I want to convey and what I want to bring out of the music, actually the technique kind of just came along with it. Wow. And it's crazy because like we talk about this a lot, but when you're in that moment, it's just like so hard to get out of that state, you know?
I know that when you were getting ready, when you were getting ready for your recital, I could just remember the feeling, because we always talk about how it just never gets easier, you know, every single time before recital, you always have that sense of panic. But yeah, I was also very inspired by how you were able to get the program ready in such a short amount of time, and like
you helped a lot though. Like on the daily, you were like giving pep talks, like get out of your mind, just enjoy the music. And really, I mean, I told you this, but it helped me so much because really, like it's about the music, you know. That's all.
It's about having fun. I always try to remember that. Because if you don't, then like that's just the most important part. Like after your recital, if you didn't enjoy it, then like what was the point, you know?
Right. Yeah.
So yeah,
I'm glad that kind of got me to snap out of that.
But you did it. You did it all
mindset.
Snap out. You just got to snap out of it.
Thank
just snap
you.
Out of it. Easier said than done. But
yeah. Well, anyway, so everything that we just talked about really ties into what we want to talk about today. So when I was talking about trying to get all the notes down, right? And just like feeling comfortable with the notes and physically being able to play all the notes, we refer to that as technique, right? But then you were talking about the imagination aspect, which is directly associated with, I think, musicality in a sense. Yeah. Right? And so this is a huge topic. When it comes to classical music, we often hear these two terms. As students, I'm sure, you know, you can't even count how many times we've heard, technique and musicality, and then we're kind of categorized into these two categories almost, you know, and, I mean, how many times have you heard, like, wow, like, look at his amazing technique, or, wow, she's so musical, or like, blah, 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 right? Yeah. But just kind of before we start this whole discussion, I kind of want to say this. We talk about this all the time, but also now that we're opening this up, I want to be very careful and considerate about our my choices of words, because you know this can be a very sensitive topic, and we kind of just wanted to bring this up though because it's such an extremely important part of classical music, and it's affected in a large part the livelihood of classical music. And I mean, not to say that we have answers. We don't have answers, which is even more of a reason why we want to bring it up. And, you know, hopefully our podcasts can be a place where you all feel comfortable talking about these things as well, so that we can all just learn and explore and grow together. And we don't want this conversation to just be between me and Polina forever, you know? And I'm sure this conversation is happening elsewhere as well. But anyways, we, as open-minded people, just wanted to open this up and hear from other people about this as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So, like I said, it's interesting to me, the topic of technicality and musicality. It seems as though musicians tend to lean more towards one or the other, but more often than not, we kind of lack the balance between the two. And this is something that I've been trying to figure out as a young musician, and I'm sure you are too as well, right? And so first, kind of like we said, just to define these two terms as a basis for the rest of our conversation, technique is basically playing the notes, right? Like how you execute the music and how you control the instrument. And then musicality kind of implies how you deliver the emotional content of the music. So anyways, yeah, let's dive into this. I think when I first look at this, like why does this affect me so much as a musician? Okay. And what comes to mind is music is art, right? And so, okay, then I want to ask you, how would you define art, or what do you think constitutes art?
To me, I think art is definitely, it's a form of expression that can be used to communicate something that words cannot otherwise. And a lot of the time, I think it deals with emotions that are kind of unexplainable to yourself, that you don't know how else to kind of communicate, but through another kind of form. And
totally.
So I definitely think there's a big, humongous emotional part and connection to that. I think it's a universal language, which is why it's so powerful.
Yeah, Totally. I completely agree. I actually, just for the sake of this podcast, went online and searched up the definition of art. Mm-hmm. And I found a couple interesting definitions. So one source says that art is often considered the process or product of deliberately arranging elements in a way that appeals to the senses or emotions. And then another source said the method and result cannot alter whether it is art. It is the intention to produce it that subsequently manifests a piece of art. So essentially, like, this way of looking at it, it's not even the final product that makes it art, but it's your intention, where it comes from, which I thought is really interesting.
Yeah.
And, you know, I completely 100% agree with how you view art. You know, it has to come from the heart, and it has to come from an emotional appeal. It needs to say something, and it needs to convey something. Right, so there we have art. And if music is art, that means music needs to encompass all of these things that we just described, right? But then we have, you know, especially with classical music, we have these two aspects of technique and musicality. And sadly to say, the technicality aspect tends to overshadow and even obliterate this idea of art, of music being art. And there's this book that I've really enjoyed reading throughout my college career, The Art of Piano Playing by Heinrich Neuhaus.
That's the book I gave you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Polina gifted me that book. Yeah, I
read that book too. It talks a lot about this.
Yeah, completely. And something that I always keep really close to my heart, something that Neuhaus talks a lot about in the book, is this idea of technique and musicality needing to be one single entity. One of the quotes from his book, he says, "For very gifted people, it is so difficult to draw a distinction between work at technique and work at music. It is all one." And that's what it should be. And we're both believers in that, that technique is equal to musicality, musicality is equal to technique. But why is it that these two terms have become their own separate entities regarding music in the first place?
I think a lot of it, to me, seems like it has come from this increased dependence on technology. And yes, the reason I say this, it kind of has to do with this article that I wrote, actually. It was a couple months ago. It's called "When Robots Take Over, Where Will Classical Musicians Go?" And it's an opinion piece, but it deals with this idea that with the rise of the internet and, you know, like recording technologies, there has been a kind of shift in the way that music is viewed. And if you take a look at some of the greatest musicians before kind of like the internet and everything, and recording equipment and all that and those kind of things, you see that you can even actually listen to pianists back then, and a lot of the time their playing is very messy, and for a lot of people nowadays it's very hard to hear because they're like, oh my gosh, like they played a note wrong here or something. And if you read the comments in those old YouTube recordings, you see that, and it's kind of crazy. But at the same time, if you really listen to them, there is this kind of like emotion and power and movement through the music that a lot of people have kind of, like, as we're saying, like technique overshadows that at a lot of the time. And I think a lot of it has to do with, because with the internet came this idea of greater perfectionism, more comparison, more competition, being able to see how people from all around the world play, which was not a thing back then. You know, that you only knew how people around you played, and you could only, you know, you could go to a concert and see how musicians played, but that was it. And it was all about that spontaneity of performing on stage. And if you made a mistake, you know, you just go on. Like, it wasn't about that, I think. And there was this different view of music and different approach, and it really just came from the heart. And so, I think this whole new digital age, as I want to call it, has been contributing to such a big emphasis on technique. And I think also something that we're going to get more into is like music education, for sure, too. Teachers and the education system, I think, have played a large role in that as well. And I think technique is more able to be taught.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've always heard this saying that you can train a monkey to play technically well, but you can't train them to play from the heart, you know? What are your thoughts on that?
About the recording, I think a huge part is our recording industry today. It's at such a high standard and such a high quality. I was reading Alfred Kurt when he was doing recordings. He was totally fine with the record selling his recordings that had wrong notes because he felt like the emotional content is there. And that's what mattered to him. Nowadays, you know, like, we have such high technology. Even if you played wrong notes, anyone can edit that out and change it. You can alter the sound quality. You can alter the notes. You can get whatever. You can transform it into whatever you want to the point where it's completely not authentic anymore in a sense, you know, because we have access to all this equipment and technology, etc. And then because we as young musicians listen to these different recordings made by different people that have been highly fine-tuned in a sense, this kind of has become our standard of playing when we play live concerts too, right? And I think that's kind of what built this kind of standard of perfection that we live by now. And because of that, often the musical aspect is neglected.
Going back to the when you were discussing Alfred Kurt, I remember in the class, I took a class in my first semester at USC where my professor, he mentioned that Kurt was doing a recording, and after he finished, the person who was recording him, he asked, he was like, would you like to redo that and make it better? And then he was like, nope. And then he was like, it might be better, but it wouldn't be as good.
I see.
It was something like that. Yeah. And because he was basically like hinting at that maybe he would have gotten more notes correct, but it wouldn't have come from the same emotional connection that he had the first time he played it. So, yeah.
That's so cool. And I love that, you know, and I wish that we had kind of stayed there at that kind of standard, but, you know.
But it's like with everything, I mean, if you take a look at also like classical ballet, like it's just people are constantly striving for more, like for higher extensions, for more pirouettes, for higher jumps. And it's always about, I think it's something that's also so measurable. And maybe that's why like people think it's easier to improve upon, I guess.
Yeah, totally.
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, completely. As I was preparing for our podcast today, I was doing some research about music history and where this idea of virtuosic technical playing actually came from. And I found some really interesting things. So if we look all the way back, actually virtuosic playing starts all the way back at the beginning of music history. So in the church services, actually even before that, like Gregorian chant, that kind of melismatic style of singing is considered early forms of virtuosity. But then if we're looking at the timeline of classical music, the prominence of this kind of technical virtuosic playing really started in the 19th century, where we had a bunch of musicians who kind of made a living and built their careers off of virtuosic playing. For example, Paganini, right? Liszt. And this actually occurred due to the fact that before then, concerts usually happened in private homes, right? Smaller salons, etc. But as the concerts started to spread out to larger performing spaces, that's actually when the growth of journalism and press came about. And because of that, obviously whatever a journalist or a press releases would significantly affect a musician's reputation and their career. And so basically technical perfection kind of became the fastest way for a musician to gain the public's attention at that time. And I read somewhere like even some musicians would personally reach out to journalists to come to get them to like write about them and things like that. And the easiest way, like you said, it's technique. In a sense, it's more measurable. And so that was the easiest way for you to catch other people's attention.
That's actually really interesting.
Right? I didn't know about this until I was reading into it. Yeah, and you're gonna love this. So, as I was looking into this, actually the first person to prominently speak against this was Schumann. So Schumann,
yes, my
so
man,
you know his
Schumann.
yeah.
No wonder.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I feel like no wonder you resonate with him so much, but
because he wrote about music. He did like some journalism work, didn't he?
Yes, exactly. His Davidsbloemter. I don't know how to pronounce that, but it's translated as the League of David, and essentially it's this imaginary society that he created in order to go against this idea of he called it like a very unartistic way of portraying virtuosity, and basically this society was created to criticize that kind of empty virtuosic kind of playing, and he called it like it's just mere entertainment, but there's no emotional content or there's no heart. He was very passionate about this whole thing, and he was worried that this would kind of destroy music and the aesthetics of music. And so he, like you said, he wrote this journal where he published all these articles with these characters that he kind of made up. And basically they were just defending music and kind of trying to bring people back to what music actually meant. And in doing so, he defended particularly Bach, Beethoven, and Schubert. And he, after they had all passed, he kind of felt like music ended with them in a way. And so basically he wanted to bring people back to this idea of artistic interpretation, and it's not just to, like, he called it empty virtuosity because there's no emotional content in it. And actually, like, for example, Schubert, right? Schubert wasn't, like, his fame didn't rise until, like, a lot later after he died. And one of the reasons he rose to prominence was actually Schumann. Because Schumann wrote about Schubert, and he just praised Schubert in the way that, you know, there's something a lot more than just the notes. So he was just fighting for and really advocating for music in that way, and I thought it was very powerful. But I don't know, sadly to say, we're kind of still in the same kind of
didn't
fight,
realize it,
like,
even started back then, because I was under the impression kind of that, you know, it was a whole different story up until, like, I don't know, mid 20th century or so. And then things started to change. That's very interesting, though.
But I do think that the reason why we seek for technical perfection and perfectionism in general today is everything that you talked about: competition, technology, and even social media, right? Like being able to hear and see how other people are doing all the time, and then it just becomes this like competitive nature that's instilled in us.
I think the social media aspect also, it gives young aspiring musicians a kind of false idea of getting things right away, because they see this result already, and they don't realize that, you know, that process basically of getting there. And it's like, you kind of want everything now. And I think that was something that affected me a lot with social media, growing up especially. And so, I don't know. The internet is just a crazy world.
If we're not even talking about music, just social media in every sense, it's inevitable that we develop this kind of competitive nature, you know, just like, oh, look at their house. So, look at like their life. And it's just, anyways, another podcast. That's for another podcast. We just have so much to talk about.
Right, so many directions.
But okay, so now I kind of want to talk about music education and how that plays into all of this and how that inevitably affects all of us. And how we view technique and musicality. So I was wondering if you could share, like, how were your lessons growing up, or like what kinds of things did your teachers emphasize for you?
So yes, all of my teachers prior to getting into college were Russian, and they were all kind of different. They had their own differences, but something interesting is I never really had to play scales or arpeggios, which, like, growing up, technique has always been the thing that I have suffered most with. And my teachers always kind of emphasized that technique comes with the pieces that you are working on. So basically, like, the hard technical parts in the pieces that I'm working on are what are going to improve my technique. And so thinking of it kind of in a musical context in that way. And I had a teacher who focused on actually imagination a lot, and she had me kind of think about the way that I was playing with analogies to things in real life. For example, in order to play fast, she was like, envision that your hands are like a race car, because they have to, like, a race car is very close to the ground, you know, so like you have to stay very close to the keys. And so it was more about like these visualizations, and even this was 10 years ago, and I still remember them all. And I think about it now to this day, and it helps me still kind of get this kind of feeling, which is very interesting. And yeah, a lot of the time everything was all about like sound and about imagining pictures with the sound. And that's how I was raised. And so I honestly, like, I played scales sometimes, but it wasn't until I got to college where really I had to be held accountable for my scales.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah, it was always kind of music before technique.
But do you feel like because you didn't have that kind of rigorous scale training that your technique had suffered because of that?
Right now, I mean, I don't know if I wish that things were different, just because I really I do value what I was able to get out of lessons. And I remember everyone would always say, like, technique will come. Like, you can learn technique, like, pretty fast, I guess. I don't know, like, not really fast, but I think it really took me finding the right way of thinking about technique to finally get it, if that makes sense. And I don't know if drilling scales is necessarily, if it would have helped me through my education growing up.
I see.
If that makes sense.
I see. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, I, just like you, had very similar upbringing as a young pianist. I only ever played scales for CM testing. Really?
Yeah. Like, I had to do that too.
Yeah, so like, I think that pretty much was the extent of my scales training, which is not very, it's very little. And just like you, my teacher would also believe that technique can be learned through the pieces that we worked on. I do have to say, though, it would take me a long time to get technical passages down when I was learning pieces. Yeah. Even though maybe because she, you know, always advocated more for the music rather than technique, it helped me a lot in just the way that I think about music and imagine music. But I do have to say, I feel like my technique suffered a bit because of that. And I feel that maybe the way that I was taught, and also I stuck with one teacher for 14 years until I went to college. So I was just always under the same kind of training for my whole life until I went to UCLA. So I would kind of say that the way that I was, so for my training, it was more of, okay, let's try to learn technique through the music, right? And then I also have friends who I know growing up, if they went through their lessons and, you know, they always had to play scales first. And if they couldn't get through their scales properly, or if there was some kind of technical issue, for the whole hour, that's all they would do. And their teacher would, no matter what, like, they can't move on until your scales are to a certain standard. And those people that I see now, they're very comfortable in their technique. And so when they come to pieces, for example, okay, I'll just give a very simple example. But like when I first started in college and I was expected to kind of have pieces prepared a little more quickly than before. I remember before college, like I would work on maybe like 3 or 4 pieces for the whole year, because like I was into the whole competition nature, and I would just use that set of pieces for the whole year to compete for all the competitions. And so I worked on those 4 pieces for a year. But then when I came to college and realized, like, oh, like sometimes you gotta learn a piece and perform it within a month. And for me, I struggled a lot because I really depended on like working on that technique for a year and then like presenting it. And so, for example, like if I was to play like an arpeggio, sometimes like I'd have to think about it. Like I have to think about like, okay, like I need to make sure my hands are doing this and blah, blah, blah. But like for people who have like drilled in that kind of training, it's just like arpeggio and then boom. But with these kinds of students, maybe because they've been practicing scales and arpeggios repeatedly for years, it's easy for it to turn into this kind of mechanical playing. And then when they approach these technical passages in the music, it becomes almost like automatic muscle memory, and then it tends to kind of lack that musical content or musical direction.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And it's like, but anyway, so we see kind of both sides where like both sides are very important, but I think we both agree that if we had to kind of emphasize one over the other, the music has to come first, right? Because in the end, it's still music, right? This podcast might end up being really long, but I kind of wanted to talk about like how can we as young musicians and performers and educators kind of make an impact on how we as a society view technique and musicality.
Yeah, so I think teachers really have a humongous impact on how musicians are raised and how they think about music. Similarly, parents, like a lot of musicians are forced into doing music rather than wanting to go into it. And for me, at least, this is also why I want to write about music, because I think like you were saying with the whole rise of journalism, that being a big impact on that idea of virtuosity and everything, because it's so measurable. If reviews were written more about the music, I think that people would realize that is more of an important part. And then musicians, like, because if musicians see that what a good review means is that, you know, they played all the notes and everything, then of course that's what they're going to be striving towards, because they think that that's what, like, that's what the public is reading, that's what the public is seeing as the standards of music. And so I think in music journalism, there's a big responsibility for shaping the way that musicians also communicate music.
Totally, yeah.
Also educating the public, I don't know, maybe doing more lecture recitals and pointing out things in the music and, you know, maybe why the composer is communicating something in a certain way, how that ties into their life, which you were doing a lot with Schubert, especially with your not senior solo, with your last master's recital, which I think I found super fascinating, because I didn't know too much about Schubert, but it really helped me kind of understand the choices that you were making and the way you were playing the music and approaching it.
Oh, I'm glad.
I don't know, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge question, and I think it's something that we are trying to figure out every day as well. And, you know, there's no one answer. But I think it's just important, kind of going back to the beginning of our podcast where we're talking about music as art, right? It comes from heart, and it comes from human emotions, right? Yeah. And when you're able to just drill passages with perfect technique and precision, without viewing it as art, then it's just another skill, you know, that you have. And playing the piano shouldn't be viewed as a skill. And I think a lot of society kind of views playing classical instruments that way, in a sense. But we need to be brought back to the fact that we're creating music, right? And I think as musicians, we really need to just stay true to our intentions with music and kind of constantly bring ourselves back to why we began playing in the first place. I would hope that it's not because you want to gain another skill, but you know, it should be about the music. And in order to play music, I feel like you need to first have something to say, right? And, you know, going back to what you were saying about teachers and their impact on this, they have a huge impact on this, right? Actually, I want to give just a quick story, because I'm also, as a teacher right now, I'm trying to figure out how to maintain this balance for my students. Because sometimes I catch myself like, oh, it says this, why are you doing that? Or, you know, you're playing wrong notes. And then immediately you kind of sense that there's this fear in them whenever they play wrong notes or whenever they do something wrong. And that's not what I want, you know? But sometimes it's hard, because it's like classical music is kind of built on this idea of, I don't want to say precision, but it's kind of part of the art for it to be very clean in a way. But anyways, I just wanted to tell this story. There was this one time I was working on a Haydn sonata with one of my students, and he was playing this phrase that clearly had a slur over it, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And the string of eighth notes that had a slur over it, and he was playing them staccato. And I stopped him and I was like, isn't there a slur over those notes? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, well, then how come you're playing them staccato? And he said, well, I just think it sounds better that way. And I think it's more fitting for the character of the piece. He's the student that I tell you about. He has a little British accent, and he's very
yes.
very proper. And I love his attitude towards music, because you can tell that, you know, he's kind of just like, I feel it this way, so I'm going to do it that way, you know? And so I sat down and I played it the way it was written for him. And I was like, but don't you think this sounds nice too? And he's like, I mean, that's quite nice, but I just like it that way. I think the staccato makes it more fun. And so at that point, I was like, you know what? Like, I appreciated that he was sharing the way that he was feeling about the music. And I didn't want to take that away from him, because he's totally entitled to his feelings and his interpretation. But also, like, as a teacher, I don't want to instill this kind of like, oh, I can do whatever I want, you know? And so I was like, okay, fine. Like, the first time around, play it the way that you see it on the score. And then when you take the repeat, do it however you want. Play it however you feel it, just so I know that you're able to follow what's written on the score. Right. And I mean, that's just a little example, but I think, and I don't even know if that's effective, but just for me, I feel like as teachers, it's important to guide them in a way where they're able to kind of make decisions about the music, even from a young age, you know? And yeah, some might say, like, we're breaking the rules, but I think with classical music, like, one of the reasons why it's maybe becoming a quote-unquote lost art is because we've kind of lost that aspect of art, right? We're sometimes like afraid to break the rules, afraid to take risks, but I think with music, with art, you need to be able to let yourself be free and to take risks and to break the rules sometimes. And anyways, I think, I don't know.
I think I would have definitely approached the way you did with your student. I think that's honestly the best way to do it, because as a teacher, of course, you need to have them be able to know what the score says, what it wants, but at the same time, that being able to have a creative outlook is so important. It's just like, like, I know so many people who lack that, and it's like, that is like being able to kind of have your own unique voice, your own unique style to playing. That's what I think music is all about too, because there's no point of having everyone play the same. You can't just, you know, if everyone exactly followed the score, like, everyone would sound the same, and there needs to be I think, your own personal voice.
Yeah, on the topic of about having your own voice, I think that really needs to start from a very young age to encourage that kind of creative thinking and imagination, right?
Yes.
And because I think the issue is a lot of times growing up kind of drilling in scales and like practicing them in a very mechanical way, kind of, it already affects the way you think about music. And it already affects the way when you come to a scale in actual music, you're going to treat it like the way you practiced it, you know? But again, like, I don't want to say that scales shouldn't be practiced, for sure. Like, we need to constantly be perfecting our technique as well in order for us to execute what we want to say with the music, right?
I think the importance is in being able to emphasize that technique is a vehicle for musicality. So it's not, so it's, it's one thing. The reason you need your technique is in order to be able to communicate what you hear inside of your head. And that's the only reason for it. They're like, when you're able to use it in order to achieve that ease, in order to communicate what you want musically, that is, I think, the point of technique.
Completely, yeah. And I believe as human beings, we all have something to say. We do. And I think it's just a matter of like knowing how to express what you want to say, but also realizing that you do have something to say. And we really need to be brought back to that kind of raw emotion when it comes to playing our instruments, and that it's not about playing all the correct notes. I think the reason why also classical music has this very high competitive nature is because of that. It's because we have this idea of perfection that we want. Like maybe I don't know, but I don't see that kind of competition in like pop music or jazz, right? Jazz is a huge topic we can get into as well. But I think we just have to realize that music is about having something to say, and that we all do have something to say, and that cannot be obliterated by striving to have the most perfect technique. And I think a lot about this actually in the context of jazz, because when I think of jazz performance and practice, like for example, like when you're watching jazz musicians play, like for me, I always feel like, and I can see it and I can hear it, they're just having fun. You know, but so often, like a lot of classical musicians I see, like you can very clearly see fear like, within them when they're performing. I think you and I both have
experienced that too.
Totally, yeah, me too. Like completely. Like most of the times, there's this fear that comes with performing, no matter how excited you are to play this music for people, right? But with jazz, I think also it's like we were saying, as educators and as teachers, if there was some kind of way to incorporate jazz into classical music, not in the sense where it's like, oh, we have to learn like jazz scales and jazz harmonies and like, but
the idea of improvisation.
Exactly. The idea of improvisation, I think, is the essence of jazz performance, right? And for them, it's like when they're on stage, if they're not in the moment, like, because the idea of improvisation is creating on the spot. And for them, it's like if they're not in the moment, then like, you know, like they're not going to be able to create anything. And they're constantly just like on the spot responding to whatever is happening. And I think that like
the thing that's crazy is that that's how classical music began. If you take a look at Bach, he was one of the greatest improvisers of all time. And then like what happened later, like for example, in piano, classical pianist and composer, that it was an identity that came together a lot of the time before. You know, a lot of the time it was inseparable too. And so that has kind of been lost now. It's usually just like composers are separate, pianists are separate. And and so the way that we approach music, I think, is so different in that way too, because back then they approached it as composers as well. Like they were just sitting down as if delivering a piece, just out on the spot, as if they were like composing it on the spot. And that's the spontaneous kind of aspect of it. Like for example, with Chopin ballades, the beginning of the first one, it sounds like it's being improvised. Or the Polina's Fantasy. Like the Polina's Fantasy that you just played, there's that in the beginning, it sounds like it's just improvised. Yeah, and I just think like it's so crucial. We need to, as classical musicians, there are a few classical pianists nowadays who do play jazz and who do improvise, like Luca de Barg, who for an encore he'll just whip out some kind of jazz improvisation or something. Or Denis Matsuyev, the Russian pianist, he does that as well. I feel like, you know, I don't know, they approach music in a different way because they have that jazz in them too.
Totally. I think that totally should be incorporated into our curriculum.
Yeah.
And actually, CM, Certificate of Merit, for CM testing, they actually started this new segment where there's a optional segment where it's improv, and students can choose to add that section into their testing, which I think is really cool and very vital to what we're talking about, just reshaping this kind of idea of technique and musicality and classical music. And anyways, there's so much to talk about on this topic, but
honestly, we could talk about this probably for days.
But I think just to top it all off, just the main point here is that these two things, technique and musicality, need to find some kind of balance, but more so we need to remember that it's about the music. It's not about how fast you can play a passage or how great your technique is, but we need to first have something to convey, have something to express. And so I wanted to end our conversation with another quote from The Art of Piano Playing, which I really love, and it says this: "In order to speak and to be entitled to be heard is essential not only to know how to speak," which is the technical side, right? "But first of all," he says, "first of all, to have something to say." So Anyways, I love that quote so much, and it really resonates with me. Yeah, so we've come to the end of our podcast. This was a long one, but I think it's just because you and I both have so much to say, and we have so much more to say, and maybe we'll make this like a series where we talk about this.
A little series,
But anyways, so to end our podcast, we have our tune of inspiration for the week. And this week, the piece that I chose is Schubert's Sonata in C minor, and specifically the fourth movement. That's like my favorite.
I love when it goes into the low register.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's like my favorite moment in the whole sonata.
Wow, really? I remember when you were so intimidated to start that movement.
It is so scary.
It was like the Tarantella.
It's a very scary movement to play.
I feel like just his last movements in general are so scary.
They're extremely weighty, and the reason why I picked this excerpt to share is because I just played it about a little over a week ago for my recital, and I love this piece so much, and I want to just talk a little bit about it and kind of relate it back to what we're talking about today. But this fourth movement of the C minor sonata is extremely significant as one of the last pieces that he wrote before he died. So Schubert, as we know, he was very obsessed with, or had this affinity to, night rides, right? So night rides, going all the way back to one of his earlier works, the Earl King, right, which is based off of this story. Basically, there's this boy who is being carried by his father horseback, and he keeps telling his dad that he sees the Earl King, which is essentially this like spiritual demon, scary figure. And his dad is like, no, like, you're just seeing the fog and blah, blah, blah. But the boy is like conversing with the Earl King. And the Earl King is like trying to lure him in and telling him to like join him. Like, he promises that he'll be rich and like that he'll get a lot of attention from his daughters, blah, blah, blah. And his dad is just like, no, like, you're not seeing anything, like, it's fine. And so I think in the poem, it doesn't say where they're going, but it seems like the boy is sick, so the father is like trying to seek medical attention or something. And so basically, as they're riding, the Earl King is like getting closer and closer, and then basically at one point the Earl King like forcefully just takes the son, or like attacks the son, and then he like screams, but then the father is just like, oh, everything's fine. And then he just like rides faster and faster. And then at the end, when they reach their destination, he looks down and his son is dead already. And Schubert is like really interested in the story, and then so he wrote, so this is a poem originally written by Goethe, and then he wrote the song set to this text. So basically throughout a lot of his music, you'll hear this kind of night ride, which is essentially, you'll hear this kind of galloping horse, and it's usually really dark. And it's said that this fourth movement, think about it, he wrote this piece just a couple months before he died. And I think the reason why he's so obsessed with this story and this idea of this Earl King, which signifies death, right, looming over, is because, like, that was really his reality. He knew he was dying for the majority of his life. And, well, not the majority of his life, but for a lot of his life, he knew that he was dying. And so there's always this idea of death kind of looming over him and chasing after him, basically. And so the fact that he wrote this at the very end of his life, actually, this fourth movement is considered to be the culmination of all Schubert night rides. And it just happens to be the last one. And to me, that's like chilling to think about, because I wonder if he just knew that was going to be the last one.
Yeah.
And it's like the most impactful. Basically, I wanted to also bring up this piece because as I was preparing for my recital, like you said, right, I was like terrified to play this piece because one, it's like, there are a lot of notes and it's supposed to be fast. But as I was like studying this piece and listening to so many recordings, I was just shocked by the number of recordings in which this movement particularly was just played to the point where it's just like, I don't feel the emotional connection to this story, which is so important. Because I think if you just think about it, it's like frightening, you know?
Yeah.
And when you play it, I feel like it should convey that kind of emotion. But I feel like so often with this movement, especially, like there's so many recordings you see where it's just like someone playing really fast, but it's extremely clear and it's very clean and it's impressive in itself, but I don't feel that kind of connection to the story, which I think like without it, it's just another piece, you know? Basically, my point is like every piece of music was written by these composers who had this intention of conveying something, right? It came from their heart. It came from their emotions, their real life things that happened to them. Real life experiences, right? And so we as artists and musicians need to approach this music with that in mind. And we can't treat it as just, you know, another quote unquote skill.
A big part of that is researching the composers and the pieces that we're playing, and I'm shocked as to how much of also my time spent learning pieces hasn't been on that, because I think it's so vital. And I only really started to get into it when I was playing some Schumann, and I was getting really interested in the life of Schumann. And through all of my research, like I came up with ways of how I need to approach the music because of who he was. Anyways, that is a whole different other topic too. But I just think that is so important. And as for us, maybe future teachers or just like any teacher in general, having the student get to know the composer that they're playing and the piece that they're playing and the context is so important.
Right. Yeah. And just to always encourage imagination, creativity over like all these other things. Anyways, we can go on for like another 1 or 2 hours, but I think this is good for now.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining in on this conversation. We hope that we can continue to have just an open conversation about all of this. And until next time. We're still waiting to hear back from Spotify, getting our podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We hope that will be something coming soon. But until then. Yeah, we have yet to be approved by those platforms. But everything else has been approved. I know. Hopefully our content can be on those platforms soon. And we'll see you all next time. Well, we won't see you, but anyways, until next time. Happy practicing. Oh, yes. Bye. All right. Bye.